In the summer of AD 251, the legions of Rome marched north, led by Emperor Decius himself, to crush the rising tide of Gothic invaders. Yet on the sodden fields of Abrittus, destiny turned cruel. The Roman army was swallowed by marshes, surrounded by relentless foes, and its emperor was cut down in the mire alongside his son. Rome had never before lost a ruler in battle against barbarians. This was no mere defeat. It was a catastrophe that shook the empire to its core. Stay with us as we uncover how this disaster at the Danube reshaped the fate of an empire. Witness the fall of an emperor, the rise of unlikely leaders, and the shadow of crisis looming over Rome. Don't forget to like, share, and join the march through history. The summer sun of AD 251 glared mercilessly upon the Balkans as Rome's legions marched northward. Banners fluttering, armor gleaming, and the weight of imperial destiny resting squarely on their shoulders. At their head rode Emperor Decius, a man of stern virtue and unshakable resolve. He had risen to power not through treachery or intrigue, but by the acclaim of soldiers who saw in him the embodiment of Rome's ancient strength. To him fell the burden of halting the Gothic tide, a tide that threatened to overwhelm the empire's northern frontier like an unending storm. The Goths had swept across the Danube in waves, plundering towns, burning villages, and scattering Roman defenses. They were no longer mere raiders, but a coalition of tribes united under fierce chieftains, hungry not only for loot but for power. Decius believed that by meeting them in open battle, Rome could reassert its dominance, remind the barbarians of their place, and restore the shaken morale of the empire. Thus the emperor led his army deep into hostile lands, chasing shadows through forests and marshes, determined to bring the Goths to decisive combat. The clash came near the town of Abrittus, a place of swamps, reed-filled waters, and treacherous ground. To Roman eyes it was ill-suited for war, but Decius pressed forward, eager for glory. The Goths, cunning in their knowledge of the terrain, drew the legions into the mire, where iron and discipline could not march as freely as before. What followed was not the orderly clash of shield against shield, but chaos. Mud clung to sandals and dragged down horses. Formations splintered as soldiers struggled through waist-deep water. Arrows rained from Gothic bows, darkening the sky, while hidden warriors emerged from thickets and marsh channels to strike the Romans where they were weakest. Cohorts lost sight of their standards, commanders lost their voices amidst the din, and the proud Roman battle line dissolved into scattered knots of desperate men. At the center of the storm, Decius stood firm, rallying his soldiers with the cry that a Roman emperor must never flee. His son, Herennius Etruscus, scarcely more than a youth, rode beside him, eager to prove himself worthy of imperial blood. Yet bravery could not defy fate. In the sucking mud, amidst the whistling of arrows and the clash of steel, the young prince fell, pierced by enemy shafts. The emperor is said to have raised his voice above the chaos. The loss of one soldier is nothing to the Republic, but soon he too was engulfed. Decius, Rome's defender, was struck down in the marsh, his body swallowed by the mire, never to be recovered. For the first time in Rome's long and glorious history, an emperor perished in battle against foreign invaders, his corpse denied even the dignity of burial. The legions, leaderless and trapped, broke apart in terror. Some fought to the death, others fled through the reeds, and still others drowned in the very swamps that had betrayed them. News of the disaster spread like wildfire. Survivors staggered south with tales of horror, the emperor dead, the heir dead, the legions shattered, their eagles lost to barbarian hands. The name of Abrittus became etched into Roman memory, not as a field of honor, but as a place of shame and sorrow. Rome had known defeat before, at Cannae, at Arosio, but never had the blow struck so close to the heart of empire. To lose an emperor on the battlefield was to strike at the very soul of Rome's authority. The disaster on the Danube was not simply a military failure. It was a wound to the empire's pride, a crack in the illusion of eternal dominion. And as the Danube's marshes swallowed the fallen, so too did uncertainty begin to swallow Rome. For the empire had entered a storm from which there would be no easy escape, a storm history would remember as the crisis of the 3rd century. Amidst the wreckage of Abrittus, Where the waters still rippled with the echoes of death, one man refused to let Rome's spirit be drowned. Trebonianus Gallus, a seasoned commander hardened by years on the turbulent frontiers, stood among the shattered remnants of the legions. He had not won glory that day, no Roman had, but in the face of despair, he carried the one thing Rome could not afford to lose: leadership. Gallus was not born into the imperial purple. He hailed from Umbria, a land of hills and fortresses, far removed from the splendor of Rome. His rise was not the product of noble lineage, but of competence. He had spent his life in service to the army, earning the trust of soldiers who knew him as a man of discipline, stern yet fair, a commander who could be relied upon in the darkest of hours. And now the darkest hour had come. With Emperor Decius dead and his son slain beside him, the legions had no anchor. Men looked around in panic, seeking a voice that could command obedience, a hand that could steady the chaos. Many wept for their emperor, others cursed the marsh that had betrayed them, but all knew that without swift order, the retreat would become annihilation. Gallus stepped forward. He did not rally his men with promises of victory. There was no victory to claim. Instead, he called for survival, for discipline, for the honor of living to fight another day. Under his command, scattered units began to reform. Centurions, their voices hoarse from shouting in the swamp, found renewed authority under Gallus's presence. Slowly, painfully, the remnants of the army extricated themselves from the killing ground, fighting their way clear of the Gothic encirclement. It was not triumph, but escape. Yet it was escape enough to preserve a Roman army where none might have remained. As the battered survivors limped back toward Roman soil, the question of succession loomed heavy. Rome could not remain leaderless. The legions, as they had so many times in the past, looked to the man who had carried them through the storm. In their eyes, Gallus was the natural choice. He had not abandoned them. He had not broken beneath the weight of defeat. If Rome was to have an emperor in this time of peril, better one who had endured the same mud, the same arrows, the same bitter taste of Gothic victory. Thus, on the field of disaster, Trebonianus Gallus was proclaimed emperor by the acclamation of his soldiers. It was not a coronation of marble and laurel, but of blood and ashes, born from necessity. The legions raised their voices in unison, hailing him as Augustus. In that moment, Gallus was transformed, not merely a commander, but the embodiment of Rome's will to survive. Yet the weight upon his shoulders was crushing. Gallus knew he inherited not a secure throne, but a crumbling empire. The defeat at Abrittus had shaken the foundations of Roman pride. Enemies watched hungrily from every border. Provinces trembled with unrest. And behind him, in Rome itself, the Senate would judge him not by noble descent or pedigree, but by whether he could shield the empire from collapse. Still, Gallus carried with him something invaluable: the loyalty of the men who had seen him act in their darkest moment. Soldiers whispered that, unlike emperors chosen by scheming senators or ambitious usurpers, Gallus had been chosen in the crucible of battle. That gave him legitimacy in the eyes of the army, the true power behind any Roman throne in the 3rd century. But the man himself remained a paradox. To some, he was cautious, even hesitant, preferring compromise over reckless valor. To others, he was pragmatic, a realist who understood that Rome could no longer afford endless wars of glory. He knew that after Abrittus, the empire did not need an emperor who could win battles. It needed one who could preserve what remained, to hold the frontiers together until Rome might rise again. Gallus's first act as emperor was not to boast of conquest, but to ensure stability. He secured the safety of the army, brought the remnants back across the Danube, and prepared for the journey to Rome. Yet every step southward was a reminder of the void left by Decius. Villagers peered anxiously at the passing columns, whispering of the emperor slain, wondering if Rome itself might be next to fall. In those uneasy days, Gallus became more than a soldier. He became a symbol of endurance. Where Decius had sought glory and perished, Gallus offered survival. Where the empire reeled from humiliation, he offered a steady hand. He could not erase the tragedy of Abrittus, nor could he restore the lives lost, but he could promise Rome that it was not abandoned. When Gallus entered the capital, he did so not as a conqueror, but as a survivor. His throne was not gilded by victory, but stained by necessity. And yet, for a moment, that was enough. The Senate confirmed his rule, the people hailed him, and Rome breathed a fragile sigh of relief. The empire still had an emperor. The empire still had hope. But hope was a fragile thing in the 3rd century. Gallus knew the shadows gathering beyond Rome's borders. He knew the Goths would return, emboldened by their triumph. He knew the Persians stirred in the east, their king Shapur eager to test Rome's weakening grip. He knew the plague still haunted the empire, sowing death among citizens and soldiers alike. Yet in spite of all these storms, Gallus had risen from disaster. He had taken command when all seemed lost, and for that, Rome endured. History would not remember him as a conqueror, nor as a savior, but in that hour of despair, he was the man Rome needed most, a leader who refused to let the empire vanish into the swamp with Decius. And so, out of the mire of Abrittus, from tragedy itself emerged the reluctant hero, Trebonianus Gallus. His reign would not be easy, his choices would be harsh, but in that fragile moment, when the empire stood trembling on the edge of chaos, he was the anchor that held Rome fast against the tide. When word of Abrittus reached Rome, it did not arrive with trumpet blasts or gilded proclamations. It arrived with weary survivors, gaunt and mud-stained, carrying stories darker than any rumor. The emperor was dead. His son was dead. The legions had been shattered in the marshes of the Danube, their eagles captured or lost. For the first time in memory, the eternal city confronted a truth it had long denied. Rome was not invincible. The news struck like thunder across the empire. In the forum, whispers spread like wildfire. Senators, once so quick to praise Rome's eternal destiny, now spoke in hushed tones of calamity. Merchants fretted over trade routes endangered by Gothic raiders. Citizens stared at statues of past emperors, Augustus, Trajan, Marcus Aurelius, and wondered if their golden age had slipped forever beyond reach. It was not only the death of Decius that unsettled them, but the manner of his fall. An emperor dying in battle might once have been hailed as noble, but to perish in a swamp, his body unrecovered, was seen not as glory, but as humiliation. Rome had lost its leader not upon a battlefield of triumph, but in mud and chaos, consumed by a foe many had once dismissed as mere barbarians. The psychological blow was immense. For centuries, Rome had cultivated an image of supremacy. Even when defeated by Hannibal at Cannae, by the Germans at Teutoburg, the empire had rebounded with renewed ferocity, avenging humiliation with overwhelming force. Yet in AD 251, something felt different. The defeat at Abrittus was not only a military failure, it was a revelation that Rome's power was no longer unassailable. The empire, sprawling and magnificent, showed cracks that could no longer be ignored. Everywhere, the signs of strain multiplied. On the frontiers, governors and generals questioned whether reinforcements would ever come. Along the Danube, communities lived in fear of further Gothic raids, uncertain whether Rome could protect them. In the east, the Persians under Shapur watched with predatory interest, calculating when to strike. Even within Italy, whispers grew of plague and famine, silent enemies no legion could repel. The Senate, guardian of Rome's traditions, found itself powerless. In earlier centuries, the Senate had been a voice of authority, guiding emperors or even appointing them. But now its decrees carried little weight beyond the walls of Rome. The true arbiter of power lay with the army, and the army had already chosen Gallus. For the senators, this was a bitter truth. Their empire, once ruled by law and tradition, now belonged to the legions and their commanders. Among the people, uncertainty bred unrest. Rome had always promised its citizens protection, prosperity, and stability. Now, with foreign raiders across the Danube and an emperor slain in the mud, that promise seemed hollow. Some began to wonder aloud if the gods themselves had turned against Rome. Sacrifices increased in the temples. Priests proclaimed ominous portents, and augurs spoke of dark times ahead. The sense of doom was not confined to the battlefield. It seeped into the very soul of the empire. For Gallus, the new emperor, the weight of this atmosphere was suffocating. He had been acclaimed by soldiers in the field, but in Rome he faced suspicion. Was he the savior who had preserved the army, or merely the opportunist who had claimed the throne from Decius's corpse? To many senators, Gallus was a provincial general elevated by circumstance, unworthy of imperial dignity. Yet, however grudging their acceptance, they had no alternative. Rome needed an emperor, any emperor, to steady the crumbling order. What haunted the empire most was the sense of vulnerability. Rome, the city that had conquered the world, now seemed unable to defend its own borders. If an emperor could die in the swamp of Abrittus, what hope was there for farmers on the frontier, or merchants crossing provinces, or settlers along the Rhine and Danube? The aura of eternal Rome was fading, replaced by the grim realization that the empire was mortal. This was not merely a political crisis, it was a spiritual one. The Roman worldview had always rested on the idea that fate favored them, that Rome's destiny was eternal. The Pax Romana, the centuries of dominance, had seemed proof enough, but now in the year 251 the veil was torn. Rome was no longer the unquestioned master of the world. It was an empire under siege, assailed by enemies without and doubts within. And as despair seeped into every corner of the empire, so too did opportunism. Governors eyed their provinces with growing independence, wondering if Rome's hand could still enforce loyalty. Generals pondered whether their soldiers' allegiance might elevate them, as it had Gallus to the purple. The unity of the empire trembled, and though few could yet see it, the seeds of the crisis of the 3rd century had been planted. The disaster at Abrittus was not the end of Rome, but it was the beginning of a long unraveling. For the first time, the empire looked into the mirror and saw fragility staring back. The people mourned their emperor, the Senate wrung its hands, the army licked its wounds, but none could deny the truth. Rome had been shaken, and the tremors would not soon subside. In the shadow of this despair, Gallus would be tested. Could he restore confidence where Decius had fallen? Could he hold the line against barbarians emboldened by victory? Could he convince an empire in doubt that Rome's future was not yet lost? The empire trembled, but it had not yet fallen. And so the fragile hope of Rome rested on the shoulders of one man, rising from tragedy into the maelstrom of history. From the swamps of Abrittus, the Goths emerged not as raiders, but as victors. They had faced Rome in open battle, slain an emperor, shattered the legions, and lived to tell the tale. For centuries, the name of Rome had carried terror into the hearts of tribes beyond its frontiers. Now, for the first time, those tribes whispered with awe, not of Roman invincibility, but of Gothic strength. The Goths were no longer a scattered people. What Rome had once dismissed as bands of restless barbarians had now revealed itself as a confederation capable of unity. Drawn together by ambition, by hunger, and by opportunity, the Gothic tribes had learned to wield their numbers and their ferocity in concert. The leaders who had orchestrated Abrittus, men like Neva, their cunning chieftain, proved that strategy, not mere savagery, guided their war. Neva had studied Rome's habits, its weaknesses, its arrogance. He knew the marshland would cripple disciplined formations, that Roman armor would become a burden in mud, that Decius's pride would drive him into a trap. In exploiting those truths, he struck a blow far deeper than the killing of soldiers. He wounded the myth of Rome itself. Word of the victory spread swiftly along the Danube and beyond. Tribes that had once feared Rome now saw a chance to challenge it. To many, the Gothic triumph was a sign that the empire's strength was waning, that the endless walls and legions could be breached. For the Goths themselves, it was a moment of transformation. They were no longer simply plunderers darting across frontiers. They were power brokers, negotiating with an empire that suddenly needed peace more than conquest. Their demands revealed the shifting balance. No longer content with raids, the Goths pressed Rome for annual tribute, gold, grain, and gifts to ensure their restraint. To Romans, it was an outrage. An emperor reduced to bargaining with barbarians, a humiliation etched into treaties. Yet for Gallus, faced with exhausted troops in a grieving empire, refusal meant annihilation. He signed the terms, and Rome bent its knee. This was the true danger of the Goths, not merely their swords, but the precedent they established. By forcing Rome to pay, they demonstrated that the empire could be compelled, coerced, humbled. Once that door was opened, others would step through it. Along every frontier, tribes would remember the Danube of AD 251 and ask themselves, why not us? The Goths also revealed an unsettling truth. They were not going away. Unlike nomadic raiders who struck and vanished, the Goths pressed against the empire's borders year after year. They hungered not only for loot, but for land, for settlements, for permanence. Their victories emboldened them to demand footholds within Roman provinces. Each concession threatened to blur the line between Roman and barbarian until it seemed the frontier itself might dissolve. To the Romans, who had long regarded outsiders as lesser, the realization was chilling. The Goths were not crude savages. They had learned Roman tactics, adopted Roman arms, and even aspired to Roman wealth and titles. But unlike Rome, they were not bound by tradition or bureaucracy. Their kings ruled by charisma and strength. Their warriors fought for plunder and pride. Their society adapted with ruthless speed. Where Rome lumbered under the weight of its own greatness, the Goths surged with youthful vigor. Even the manner of their warfare gnawed at Roman confidence. The legions had been built for open fields, for steady lines, for discipline honed over centuries. The Goths fought differently: swift raids, ambushes, cavalry charges from unexpected quarters. They struck where Rome was weakest, vanished into forests or marshes, and returned before defenses could rally. At Abrittus, they had shown they could also fight a pitched battle and win. This versatility made them a nightmare opponent, one Rome could not easily anticipate. In the streets of Rome, citizens spoke their name with dread. To lose a legion was tragedy. To lose an emperor was calamity. But to be forced to buy peace from barbarians was humiliation. The Gothic threat became a shadow looming over the empire's imagination, a reminder that the frontier was no longer a wall of security, but a door through which invaders could stride. Yet to the Goths themselves, the victory was more than military. It was cultural awakening. Their bards sang of the day they humbled the world's greatest power. Their children grew up with stories of Roman defeat. Their warriors bore Roman armor, stripped from corpses as trophies. They no longer looked upon the empire as a distant, untouchable giant. They saw it as prey, wounded, vulnerable, and rich beyond measure. In the years to come, Gothic raiders would strike deeper, reaching the Aegean, plundering cities that had stood since Alexander. Their ships would blacken the Black Sea. Their banners would fly in places Rome had long considered untouchable. The seeds planted at Abrittus bore fruit in fire and ash. For Gallus, the price of survival was clear. He had preserved Rome by conceding to Gothic demands. But to many Romans, it felt like betrayal. What was an emperor who bought peace instead of winning it? What was an empire that bowed before barbarians? The Goths had done more than kill Decius. They had exposed the empire's vulnerability to its own citizens. And so, in AD 251, the Goths became more than raiders, more than foes. They became the embodiment of Rome's new reality, an empire no longer feared, but tested, no longer unquestioned, but challenged. They were the counterweight to Rome's pride, the adversary that revealed the empire's fragility. The Danube Disaster was not their final victory, nor was it Rome's final defeat. But from that moment onward, the Goths stood as a permanent force in the drama of history. An enemy that Rome could neither destroy nor ignore, a people whose rise signaled that the age of uncontested Roman dominance was drawing to a close. When Gallus assumed the purple, the empire did not cheer with triumph. It exhaled with exhaustion. His acclamation on the battlefield was not the coronation of a conqueror, but the elevation of a caretaker. Rome did not demand glory from him, it demanded survival. Gallus understood this grim truth more clearly than anyone. He had seen the marshes of Abrittus, had watched the legions drown in mud and chaos, had felt the weight of despair pressing upon soldiers who had lost their emperor. Unlike rulers who chased immortality through conquest, Gallus accepted that Rome in AD 251 needed not glory but breathing room. His reign would not be one of expansion, but of preservation. The first step was peace with the Goths. To many Romans, it was unthinkable. The empire had never before paid tribute to barbarians. Tribute was something demanded of conquered peoples, not of Rome itself. But Gallus saw the choice clearly. The army was broken, the frontiers weakened, the treasury strained, and the people shaken. Another campaign would mean annihilation. A treaty, however humiliating, would mean time. So Gallus signed the pact. He promised the Goths annual payments in gold and grain, not as conquest but as appeasement. In return, the invaders withdrew, at least for a season, giving the empire space to recover. Rome's pride was wounded, but its heart still beat. Gallus knew history would judge him harshly for this act, but he gambled that survival today was worth the shame tomorrow. Back in Rome, he presented the treaty not as submission, but as prudence. To the Senate, he argued that the empire needed stability to heal. To the people, he promised security, that the raids would cease, that families could till their fields without fear of fire and steel. To the army, he vowed to rebuild their strength, to restore discipline, and to prepare them for the day when Rome could once more meet its enemies on equal ground. His words were not fiery proclamations of conquest, but measured tones of reassurance. Gallus did not inspire awe as Decius had. He inspired endurance. And though many grumbled at his concessions, his steady hand prevented the empire from collapsing outright. But Gallus's challenges extended far beyond the Danube. Even as he secured peace with the Goths, another storm gathered in the east. Shapur, the ambitious king of Persia, prepared to test Rome's weakened resolve. Already his forces had raided deep into Roman lands, capturing cities and pressing against Syria. Gallus knew he could not face two enemies at once. The treaty with the Goths freed him to redirect attention eastward, even if only cautiously. Worse still, a far more insidious enemy stalked the empire. Disease. The plague that had haunted Rome for decades surged again during Gallus's reign. It swept through towns and camps, cutting down rich and poor alike, soldier and civilian. No treaty could restrain it, no legion could defeat it. Gallus faced the grim reality of leading a people who felt besieged not only by barbarians, but by fate itself. Yet even amid these calamities, Gallus clung to his role as Rome's shepherd. He issued edicts to ease the suffering, distributed grain to the starving, and ordered temples to pray for divine mercy. These acts were not dramatic, but they mattered. They reminded citizens that the empire still had a guardian, that the purple was not vacant, that someone still bore the burden of Rome's survival. His reign, however, was shadowed by constant criticism. The Senate saw him as weak, a man who bought peace rather than seized it. Soldiers grumbled that their emperor had abandoned the offensive spirit of Rome. Even common citizens muttered that the gods must have cursed the empire to place such a cautious man on the throne. But Gallus, unshaken, endured their doubts. He knew that in times of crisis, survival itself was a form of victory. Gallus also made a bold political move to consolidate his fragile authority. To quiet unrest and strengthen legitimacy, he elevated Decius's surviving son, Hostilian, as co-emperor. By honoring the bloodline of the fallen emperor, Gallus signaled continuity rather than usurpation. It was a shrewd gesture, one that briefly soothed suspicions that he had profited from Decius's death. Yet fate was cruel. Hostilian soon perished. Whether by plague or intrigue remains uncertain. And Gallus was left once again to bear the burden alone. Still, he persevered. For nearly 2 years after Abrittus, the empire endured under his cautious stewardship. Rome did not collapse, though it trembled. Its frontiers did not vanish, though they strained. Its people did not revolt, though they despaired. That endurance was Gallus's legacy, not victories to be carved on monuments, but the fragile gift of time bought through compromise. Gallus was not blind to the cost. He knew his treaty with the Goths had set a precedent of weakness. He knew his concessions might embolden others, but he also knew that without such measures, Rome might already have crumbled into chaos. His reign was a holding action, a pause in the storm, a fragile bridge carrying the empire toward whatever future awaited. To later generations, Gallus would seem timid, even cowardly. Historians would remember him less as a conqueror than as a caretaker. Yet to the Romans who lived through the nightmare of 251, his cautious choices meant survival. He was the man who steadied the empire when it staggered, who kept the lamps of Rome burning through a night that threatened to extinguish them forever. For in times of triumph, heroes are remembered for their victories. But in times of crisis, heroes are those who prevent collapse. Gallus was such a man. His reign did not restore Rome's greatness, but it preserved Rome itself. And without preservation, there can be no restoration. And so, against all odds, the empire endured. It did not rise in glory under Gallus, but it did not fall either. He gave Rome the most precious resource of all, time. Time for new leaders to emerge, time for new strategies to form, time for the wounded colossus to catch its breath. In the shadow of catastrophe, Gallus became not the conqueror Rome desired, but the shepherd it required. Rome had stumbled at Abrittus, bled at the Danube, and endured the humiliation of tribute to barbarian kings. Yet the empire did not collapse. It staggered, yes, but still it breathed. From the ashes of defeat, a strange resilience began to stir, as if the colossus that spanned the Mediterranean refused to be buried by a single calamity. Gallus had given Rome time, and time itself became the seed of renewal. Legions that had fled in chaos at Abrittus slowly reorganized. New recruits filled the shattered ranks, hardened by necessity. Commanders forged in fire emerged from obscurity, men who had seen Rome humbled and would dedicate their lives to ensuring such disgrace never happened again. The sting of defeat created not despair alone, but a grim determination. The empire's scars became its teachers. Where once arrogance had blinded generals, humility now sharpened their vigilance. No longer could Rome assume that barbarians were mere raiders. The Goths had proven themselves formidable, adaptive, and relentless. To confront them again, Rome would have to fight smarter, not simply harder. The empire's strategists began to rethink their defenses, fortifying border towns, improving supply lines, and reinforcing critical strongholds. The limes along the Danube, once thought sufficient, were strengthened into bulwarks against further invasion. In Rome itself, the memory of Abrittus haunted the Senate and people alike. But from that haunting grew a sober unity. Senators who once squabbled over prestige now recognized that internal discord had left the empire vulnerable. Even the common citizens, though weary of war, rallied behind the necessity of resilience. Festivals and ceremonies honored the fallen, while prayers sought divine favor for Rome's rebirth. The humiliation had wounded pride, but pride, once wounded, often heals into iron resolve. Most of all, the army itself, once broken in the marshes of the Danube, rose again. Veterans who survived the disaster swore oaths never to see such shame repeated. Young recruits, too young to have fought under Decius, were raised not in the glory of conquest, but in the memory of catastrophe. This new generation of soldiers bore not triumphal arrogance, but a hardened realism. They did not march for laurels, they marched for survival, for vengeance, for Rome, and vengeance would come. Within a decade, Rome would strike back at the Goths with ferocity. Gallienus and later emperors, heirs to the lessons of Abrittus, reorganized cavalry units, improved rapid response forces, and forged a new military doctrine that would define the empire's survival through the 3rd century. The Gothic victory had been devastating, but it had awakened Rome to a truth. The empire could not rely on old habits, on static legions and ancient confidence. It had to evolve or perish. Even the humiliation of paying tribute bore fruit. Rome's leaders, though ashamed, recognized that money could be wielded as a weapon as surely as steel. Buying time against one enemy allowed resources to be directed elsewhere, to other frontiers, to other threats. The empire learned that survival in an age of crisis required flexibility, pragmatism, and above all, endurance. The plague, too, became a grim teacher. Its endless toll reminded Romans of mortality, of the fragility of human ambition. Yet it also cultivated a strange resilience. Communities learned to endure loss, to persist despite empty streets and silent temples. Those who survived the pestilence were hardened, and their survival gave Rome a grim continuity. Even disease, as terrible as it was, could not extinguish the empire. And so, from every wound, some measure of renewal emerged. The shattered legions became sharper blades. The humbled Senate became more united. The grieving people became more resilient. Rome itself became less arrogant, more adaptive, and in that adaptation lay the seeds of survival. The Gothic storm at Abrittus had seemed like the end of days. An emperor dead, an army destroyed, barbarians triumphant. These were omens of collapse. Yet Rome had seen many omens before, and still it endured. The sack by the Gauls, Hannibal at the gates, the civil wars of Marius and Sulla, all had threatened annihilation, and all had been overcome. Abrittus would join this litany of scars, another reminder that Rome's greatness was not the absence of defeat, but the refusal to yield to it. For though Rome could bleed, though Rome could stumble, Rome could not yet fall. As the empire marched forward into the chaos of the 3rd century, its enemies grew fiercer and its crises deeper. Emperors would rise and fall, cities would be lost and retaken, and the very fabric of the empire would seem to unravel. Yet the memory of Abrittus, the nadir of shame, would linger as a warning and a call to endurance. Rome's strength was no longer measured solely in conquest, but in its power to recover from catastrophe. Thus, the tragedy of 251 became paradoxically a source of renewal. Rome, the wounded giant, staggered yet refused to collapse. It absorbed the blow, learned from it, and prepared to rise again. The phoenix of Rome, though scarred and weary, still carried embers in its heart, and those embers would kindle fire once more, until even the darkest night of the empire gave way to dawn.